I also teach design, product design at Stanford University here in California. And Dave Kelly, who was my advisor when I was an undergrad there, he was the founder of IDEO, co-founder of IDEO. He also started the D.School at Stanford, and he's quite well known in the design world. So what we teach at Stanford is called human-centered design, or we teach a concept called design thinking. Design thinking arises often as when the challenge is more ambiguous.
From the city of Peaky Blinders, Birmingham, England, I would like to introduce you to Paddy Dandar.
As the world becomes more automated and the robots take over, it's imperative that we build the right human skills for the future. So pull up a chair, grab a samosa or two, and make yourself very uncomfortable. So Eli, thank you so much for joining me today. I'd love to know which superpower you'd like to bring to this particular episode.
I'd like to discuss curiosity.
Curiosity. That's always an interesting one because I've found over the years, just through small talk and approaching complete strangers and striking a conversation, you just never know where the conversation is going to lead. So I do like curiosity for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
And just for the listeners, could you just tell us a little bit about your background and what is it that you are famous for?
Well, I don't know if I'm famous, maybe slightly internet famous, if that, but I do a podcast called Design Better, which is about creativity and at the intersection of design and technology. And certainly it's about curiosity too. In fact, our company name is the Curiosity Department. And I also teach design, product design at Stanford University here in California. Been doing that for about 12 years. So I do a mixture of teaching and podcasting, and then some amount of consulting work. My background is in design. I did physical product design for a number of years and then moved to more digital design. So I have some experience in both. But over the last handful of years, I've been more of a educator and content creator than a actual hands-on designer.
Oh, nice. I was going to say, are all of the professors at Stanford superstars? Because I had Matt Abrahams on a while back and he does the amazing podcast as well. And yeah, it just seems like you're all celebrities. Like, is that something that Stanford encourages?
No, I don't know. It's funny. We've had Matt on our show too, and he's great. So not necessarily. There's certainly a lot of unsung heroes at the school and some that keep a low profile. And I think the only reason I'm known is because to make the show work for us as a business, we have to be somewhat known in the world. As I'm sure you know, as a podcaster, like having an audience is key to being able to make it into a business. But there's certainly people that do very interesting work. People are much more well-known than I am, either on the professorship side of things that have done amazing research, or in our department, there's more of a mixture of lecturers and people who are out in the professional world. So oftentimes they come in as lecturers having very extensive, interesting career and background. And an example is Dave Kelly, who was my advisor when I was an undergrad there. He was the founder of IDEO, or co-founder of IDEO. He also started the D.School at Stanford, and he's quite well known in the design world. So yeah, I would say there's some very well-known people there. There's also some really great people that folks maybe outside Stanford don't know about.
I'd love to know what piqued your interest in this field, because I'm pretty sure as a 10-year-old, your dream job wasn't to go into product design. Like, what was your mindset like back then, and how did you end up in this field?
No, I don't think I was aware. Not many people were aware of product design back then. Design wasn't as recognized as it is now. My earliest career sort of dream was to be a dinosaur dentist, which it also is not a thing, but I came about because I saw on the public television these paleontologists excavating bones with dental tools. And so I thought, oh, they must be dinosaur dentists. So that was an early career dream. As I was younger, I got interested in things like marine biology. I also drew a lot as a kid. I got interested in illustration and drawing and printmaking. And so I think my initial career dream was to head down more of an artistic route, maybe with a focus on science too. So scientific illustrator. One of my kind of childhood heroes is a guy named Ray Troll, who is an artist and illustrator, lives up in Alaska, and just well known for drawing fish and dinosaurs. He was kind of a hero of mine when I was a kid, and I got the chance to know him as an adult and actually interviewed him on my first podcast, which never truly launched. But anyway, yeah, so I think I certainly didn't have design in mind. And when I got into Stanford, I learned about this major called product design, which was a mix of art and engineering. And I kind of also considered doing art school. When I tell when I tell the story, my parents are always kind of sad if they hear it, but I wouldn't say they pushed me in any way. That they encouraged me to explore areas where I might have a more rigorous technical education in addition to the art side of things, which I very much appreciate. And so I ended up doing the product design program, and I did kind of struggle through the engineering. I'm not naturally great at math, and I got through it. And the art courses I loved. So yeah, I did that undergrad, and then I ended up coming back to my love for marine biology in a way, and I spent a year in Bermuda randomly after graduating, working at a biological research station, and then moved to the area where I am now, where I worked on making underwater camera housings for cameras. So things that you would use to take photographs underwater and lighting equipment, things like that. So that was kind of a mix of several of my interests, and I've over the years continued to try to. I've had kind of wandering, weird career path, but mix the things I'm interested into the careers I try or choose or experiment with.
Phenomenal, because as a kid, I was very artistic. I can't say I was Van Gogh or anything like that, but
Mm.
I used to doodle everything and just loved being creative. And I come from a very traditional Indian background, Indian family, and my mum was always like, "That's not going to pay the bills. You need to be either a doctor or something
Mm.
else." And I
Yeah.
didn't have the brains to be a doctor, so I went in tech. But over the years, there's always been a part of me that's had this niggling feeling that I want to bring more creativity into the work that I do. And
Mm.
so then I got into training, and I use a lot of visualization and visual thinking for that.
Yeah.
So for anyone out there who is interested in product design, doesn't really know what it's all about, what is it? And for what type of people do you think it would be suitable as a profession?
Yeah. So, well, coming back to our theme of curiosity, I think it suits curious people very well as a profession because big part of it is understanding humans and human behavior and how they interact with products, experiences in the world. And so there's a few sides to it. So there's that side where what we teach at Stanford is called human-centered design, or we teach a concept called design thinking, which is all about understanding the people that you're designing for a long time. So we actually came out of the mechanical engineering department at Stanford back in the 60s. And back then, engineers certainly they thought about people, but they didn't necessarily put them at the center of the way that they're building products. So they wouldn't necessarily like build a prototype and show it to people and get feedback or see how they used it. They would just focus on the engineering side. So what product design tries to do is bring the human into the design process, and they do that. We do that in a number of ways. One is through trying to what we call empathize with people, understand your kind of daily challenges. And we do that by observational types of things, interviews, watching them at work or at play or whatever kinds of spheres we're designing for. We use both qualitative, so interview type stuff, and quantitative data to understand human behavior. We try to frame the problem in such a way that attempts to make sure we're addressing the root challenges of whatever products we're designing. So sometimes the initial design challenge isn't the actual challenge that you want to face. I'll give an example here because it's interesting. So one of the classes, I don't teach this particular class, but a colleague of mine does, and it's called Design for Extreme Affordability. And the class tries to go into developing countries and help with significant design challenges in those areas. And one of the early classes was trying to address infant mortality in Nepal. And what happens is that when a baby is born prematurely, they need to be in an incubator to be kept at the right temperature so they can survive those early stages. And a lot of babies were dying from essentially like hypothermia because they weren't getting access to incubators. And The design team initially thought the design challenge was, well, we need to design an affordable incubator so that the hospitals can afford to have them for babies. So they could have done that and then done it all from Stanford and come to Nepal and showed off these cheaper, less expensive incubators. But they didn't do that. They actually went to Nepal, started interviewing people at the hospital, and one of the students was there, noticed that like there was all these incubators sitting unused, and talking to the doctor, they said, "Oh, we have plenty of incubators, but what the problem is that these babies often are in very rural areas, and it takes them hours or maybe even more than a day to get to the hospital. And by that time, they're often it's too late. They've died from hypothermia." And so they said, "Oh, okay. So we need to design for something that's portable or can be used in these remote villages." And so the solution they came up with, it's called Embrace, and it was basically a sleeping bag, a little baby sleeping bag with a heating element. And they created that, and they actually started a company. It's out in the world, and it's saved thousands of lives at this point. So that's one specific story about reframing a problem such that you're designing for the right solution area. Another part of it is prototyping. And so also in that story, they prototype. They learned some interesting things in prototyping. One was that they initially had temperature gauge because the heating element needs to be heated up to a certain temperature. And the temperature gauge was like a thermometer. It looked like a thermometer. And they were trying to explain it to the moms, and the moms were using it. And they noticed that the moms were only heating it up halfway. And they questioned why this was. And it turns out that oftentimes Western medicine is seen as very powerful, and that the moms in these villages would use like a half dose of what would be a normal dose. So they were only heating it up halfway. So they changed the design such that it was more binary. It was either too cold or too hot, or too cold or the right temperature. So that fixed that particular challenge. And that was only learned through prototyping it and testing in the field. And so all these different phases of design are meant to really understand the human challenges and design the right product and experience for the people that are using your products.
Oh, that reminds me of the famous TED Talk. I think it's Doug Dietz. I might have pronounced his name wrong.
Oh yeah, yeah. The GE Healthcare,
He tells a really emotional story around the way he had to redesign the sort of
right?
MRI
Yep.
scanners, and that was actually heart wrenching when you watch that TED Talk. It just got me so emotional, and I think a lot of people get very emotional, and he himself is in tears at the
Yeah,
story. The impact I think product designers can have, and your stories you just mentioned there. What an amazing outcome.
yeah, yeah. No, that they have many stories
Yeah.
like that.
And I hear a lot of people commercializing design thinking.
Hmm.
There's almost this sort of product that everybody's
Yeah.
selling out there as a
Hmm.
training course and an approach. But I hear the D.School sort of do it in a different way, and it's not as simple as just a double diamond that everybody talks about. Do you have any views on that? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, well, I think any concept once it becomes popularized, it can be used incorrectly or, like you say, packaged and sold in such a way that it's not having the intended outcomes. And I don't think it's a perfect methodology. It's a tool like many other tools, and you can use it well or use it poorly. I think even at places like the D School, I think one thing that happens sometimes is people get very excited about the first part of the process, interviewing people, understanding their needs, trying to define, and then they fall a little short in the implementation side, where that's oftentimes where the more technical, challenging work comes in. And so I do think there can be a danger of design theater where people get together, they put a lot of post-its up on the wall, they create all these great ideas, and then it doesn't go anywhere. And that can happen for sure. And so I think you need to be conscious that for a design to work, it needs to be implemented, and so you need to have those capabilities, and that can be challenging within the constraints of something like a workshop or a design sprint. But hopefully, you have the tools to prototype and create the product you're working on, and it's actually becoming more and more accessible with things like generative AI, and I could talk about that, but those types of tools are opening up a lot of doors for folks that aren't necessarily designers or engineers to create prototypes to test ideas with people.
And I'd love to hear your perspective on sort of the history of design thinking in terms of
Mhm.
how it started, and if we could sort of touch upon some of those modern tools that are helping in the field, as you mentioned there, sort of generative
Yeah, sure.
AI.
Yeah, as far as origins, I there's probably several places where it arose, and maybe it wasn't always called design thinking in each of them. The story that I know comes out of Stanford and with David Kelly's work, and I'm sort of paraphrasing the story here, and these aren't maybe the exact words that he would use, but I think, again, this is early in the early days of the product design program. These other disciplines like engineering and business had their own modes of attacking a problem. So if you have an engineering problem and if you need to design a bridge, that you use math and structural engineering and things that are very known and standardized to make the bridge. You don't need design thinking necessarily to build a bridge. You just engineer and build the bridge. Similarly with businesses understand how to optimize and make a product at a profit. And so if you have a product that's relatively a commodity and you want to make a profitable business, you put on your business thinking hat and you could do that. You don't need design thinking. Where design thinking arises often is when the challenge is more ambiguous, where it's something new or you want to create something innovative, or like I said in this case study with Embrace, it's a problem that's not being addressed. And if you if you address it without understanding the context, you might make the wrong solution or you might design for the wrong solution. So that's where design thinking comes in. So going back to where is it effective or is it being used correctly? Like it doesn't always need to be used. There are problems that require engineering thinking or business thinking. And then there are the more, I'd say, ambiguous problems where design thinking can be more helpful. So that's rough origins of it, and David popularized it both through the program, but also through IDEO, and it became a core part of their offering, and many other agencies followed suit. And so on the sort of fast forward today and generative AI, it's interesting because I've been running a series of workshops with a colleague named Bobby Hughes, who was at IDEO for a long time and also Stanford. And we thought that there was an opportunity to help people bring Gen AI into the design thinking process and explore it. And it's proven to be very, we've gotten some really interesting results and feedback because I think the big thing is people are both curious and afraid of AI, and they don't often have time in their day to day work to play around with it. And David Kelly talks about creative confidence, which is just the idea that we're all born creative essentially. And even if as adults we don't think of ourselves as a creative, we can practice it and build our confidence. And I think you can do something similar with Gen AI where you might think like, oh gosh, is this going to take my job? Or I don't even, you can just bury your head in the sand. Like, I don't even want to think about this. But I think by exploring it and using it and playing around with it, you can develop a more confident, curious mindset. And that's what we're trying to enable. So we've been doing that for individuals and companies. And yeah, I think it can be. The other thing is that it's a question mark in what parts it's helpful and what parts it might be harmful, because you can also use it to generate, let's say, a relatively high fidelity mock-up of an app. But is that the best thing to be prototyping or testing with when your thinking isn't that developed? I think that's a question mark, and AI might cause people to leap past certain stages of the design process and not learn as much as they would if they were prototyping with wireframes or pencil and paper or doing the things that you're thinking while you're designing. So yeah, so there's interesting things that we've explored and people have shared with us, and happy to dive further into that if you like.
Yeah, because I'm really curious about, I guess, that creative process that we have at the start. So it's being curious, it's trying to understand the problem. Can AI help with that? And do you have some examples of where you've tried
Mhm.
certain things and what have been the
Yeah, I
outcomes?
think it can. So the things that we've so what excuse me, our workshop does is the first portion of it, we just essentially try to map AI to the various parts of the process. So I walk through the process with empathy and defining the problem and ideating and prototyping, et cetera. So let's say in the empathy stage, we could use AI to help us come up with a list of interview questions. So let's say, going back to the Embrace example, I'm going to go interview a doctor in Nepal about babies, premature babies and incubators. can you help me come up with a list of interview questions that I might use? And it can help you do that. Now, you'd want to, as a human, evaluate whether those are good questions or bad questions, or pick the ones that are relevant, because as you probably know, working with AI, it can often hallucinate and give you terrible answers in a very confident fashion, right? So it's good to be a judge of those answers and be knowledgeable, ideally, in the domain that you're working in. But yeah, and then in the ideate phase, it can help you brainstorm and come up with ideas. The way that we position it in these workshops is as an effective but often incorrect intern, where you can assign a task, it'll bring something back to you quickly, but you have to check its work because it hallucinates and is confident about its hallucinations.
And would that be in terms of tools, sort of the standard ChatGPT type of tool, or are there specific tools for
Mhm.
product design that you're looking at?
Yeah, so there are specific tools. That's another thing we try to expose in the workshop. So ChatGPT is great, and it's capable of creating images and other things, but there are more specific tools. So there's one called Galileo that helps you can create essentially an app or website from a text prompt. Now Figma, the design tool, has some of those capabilities built into it. There's ones for physical product design where you can create a sketch, import a sketch, and it will create a more realistic rendering and sometimes even a 3D model. It's sort of nascent phase, and it doesn't always do a great job, but for what it is, it's interesting. I don't remember the name of it offhand, but I can share it for you with your show notes. And then, yeah, there's other tools too, tools that are on the fun side, like for making songs, but you can imagine using that for, say, marketing materials, and then the more image oriented things like Midjourney, um, tools like that. So yeah, there's a range of tools. Some of them are specialized and work within the realm of domain of product design. And then the other thing that these tools allow you to do is extend your capabilities as a designer. So one demo that I do for the class is have them where I show creating a version of Pong, the game Pong, early arcade game, in the browser with ChatGPT. So you can say, hey, ChatGPT, help me create a version of Pong for the browser in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. It'll do that. You can copy that code into a tool like CodePen, where you can sandbox little applications, and it'll make it. And then it'll make mistakes, but cool thing is you can work with it to improve the game or add scoring to it or change the colors of the paddles. Or so it's a great way for learning to code and extending your capabilities. As a designer, I've made little apps myself. I don't have developer background really. I've played around with it, but it lets me build things and build prototypes in a way that I really couldn't before.
Oh, amazing. And
Yeah.
I'm going to try that. That's a super cool little activity.
Yeah, share it with your daughter too. The kids as well. Yeah.
Now, one of the things I'm really passionate about is creativity and sort of building that creative muscle. Are there techniques that you use to help people with their creativity?
Yeah, no, I think it is a learn, and kind of rewinding back to, I mentioned Dave Kelly and he has a book called Creative Confidence. And so there are many ways to be creative, obviously, from sketching to songwriting to sculpting, you name it. And I think it's about curiosity and being curious about an area, and then just playing. Really, I think that's really the best way to develop creativity. So if you're excited about, let's say, I don't know, sketching, the best way to do that is pick up a pen and assign yourself a project. I'm going to sketch once a day for 100 days, whatever it is you want, a still life, a portrait of my kids, something out in nature. So it really is about just practice and building up that confidence. So that's one way to do it. I think another way is trying to figure out, even if your role isn't necessarily a creative role, ways that you can bring creativity into your work. And I'll give the example of my mom, who is a physician. She's retired now, but she is a psychiatrist, and psychiatry isn't necessarily the most creative job in the world. You're diagnosing people, you're understanding their mental health issues, you're prescribing medicine. So she wanted and she's a creative person and wanted to have more creativity. So she decided to help out with the teams that were working on medical records, like digital medical health records, which at the time was sort of a new thing and kind of an open field for creative problem solving. So she voluntarily took on some of these roles where she was helping with these problems that brought in more creative problem solving skills than her psychiatry work did. So I think that's another way is to think about your day to day work and ways that you might be able to make it more creative, even if it isn't part of your core responsibility.
I love that because often when we say the word creative, people look to people that do art and music, and we forget that actually there are lots of professions. Actually, every profession can be creative in some way or other. And you just mentioned a great example there. So it's within all of us, and we can definitely practice that. In terms of AI, it's kind of this scary monster at the moment. Nobody quite knows where it's going to end, and it probably will never end. But for product design, do you see the role changing drastically? And do you ever see it diminishing such that AI will take
Mm.
over much of what we do as product designers?
Yeah, I think it depends a little bit on the time frame. At some point, people talk about a general intelligence, artificial general intelligence being developed. That's certainly a possibility, and I don't think we know what will happen once that is a reality. It's going to impact us in ways we can't even imagine right now. So I'll put that aside and say that I have no idea what's going to happen if and when a general intelligence is developed. In the shorter term future, I do I think there are two sides to it. There is a positive side, which is I've been talking about sort of this extension of our capabilities as a designer. So if I'm a designer that wants to experiment more with code, generative AI is going to enable me to do that very quickly and learn very quickly. And that's great. If I'm a designer that wants to take some of the boring stuff off of my plate, let's say like coming up with interview questions, or maybe you might enjoy that. I personally don't. So you could have ChatGPT do that for you. And again, you have to be a curator and you have to understand, the types of questions that are good questions and bad questions. But so those are some of the positive things. I think on the negative side, again, we touched on this, but it might leapfrog some of the thinking that you need to do as a designer in those early stages when you're sketching or, paper mock-ups or wireframes, or if you're a physical product, if you're sculpting or, creating it out of say for a prototype or mock-up. While you're doing those things, you're thinking, and if you skip it, you may be losing out on opportunities. I think too, if you've been in the field for a while, you realize that a lot of the really interesting ideas come out of mistakes that you're making along the way. A lot of you might have a vision for how you want to create something. And as you're doing it, you realize, oh, I can't quite get there, but this other path that it's taking me down is actually much more interesting and creative and innovative. So that's the danger, I think, is that not so much that that these tools will take your job away, but they'll take away stages of the work that make the work meaningful or more innovative or have a stronger impact. So that's kind of the way I see it in the short term. The long term, I don't think anybody knows for sure right now.
I love that as well because I often use the word yet when someone says, "Oh, but AI can't feel emotion the way we could."
Hmm.
And then there's always that, yes, but not yet. We
Yeah.
just don't know. And yeah, it's just about keeping that open mind, isn't it? I had a bit of a fun question for you. Is there a product that you have always wanted to design that you haven't quite
Mm,
done just yet?
that is a good question. Um, Let me think about that one for a second. Well, so I do a lot of surfing and free diving in my area, and I've never really designed products for those kind of activities. So that would be fun to think about doing. I've had a few ideas and haven't had the time to make anything, but yeah, it kind of comes back to I try to tie together the work I do and the things I'm interested in, and so that would be cool. I also do a lot of cooking, and I can imagine things in the realm of cooking that would be fun to design for. But yeah, I don't have anything really, really specific in that right now.
Yeah, that was a big question, and it's one that I think
Yeah.
required a bit of thought. So that's unfair on my part, but no, thank you.
No, no, all good. It's interesting. Got me thinking. So
And Eli, I know we're fast approaching time because you've got to pick up your kids, so I don't want to keep you too long, but I'm sure people listening would be really interested to know about any useful books, resources that you would recommend for someone who's thinking about taking this step into product design. Is there something that you
sure.
could suggest for us?
Yeah, let me go grab a few off my shelf, and I'll bring them over
Okay,
here.
awesome.
A lot of great books out there. Um, so this one, not necessarily one you think, but maybe is commonly thought of when you talk about design. It's called Six Thinking Hats by Edward de Bono. This one came about because we've been lucky enough to have Johnny Ive, the designer from Apple, in our class a few times. And this is one of the books that he recommended. And the kind of premise, it's a short book, but premise is when you're working on problems, it's helpful to sort of put on a different thinking hat at times. Sometimes it's helpful to put on the hat of the critic. Sometimes it's helpful to put on the hat of the innovator. Sometimes it's helpful to put on the hat of the business person. I'm probably messing up the different kinds of hats, but they're in this book. He found it very helpful in his work at Apple, and so I'd recommend this book. This one is called Sprint. It's by a friend named Jake Knapp, and this is about even if you're not a designer, about how you might bring design into your workflow and just an easy kind of week-long sprint. So, and it talks a lot about the different kind of methods we talked about earlier. So that's a great one. It was developed when he was at Google Ventures. So they've helped a lot of startups address design challenges, and you can bring it into your work too. So Sprint by Jake Knapp. And then I already talked about this one, but just so we have it in front of us, this is Creative Confidence, Dave Kelly and his brother Tom. So this is a great one. If, like the question you asked earlier, can we become creative later in life? This book very much says yes, and it gives some ideas for how you might do that. So that's another good one. Those are my current three.
Awesome. I like threes. Threes are good to remember. So thank you so much. Yeah, I love Jake Knapp's book because I think design thinking is quite wide, and often I think people like there to be a nice blueprint for people to say, right, how do I run this? And he's got that nice 5-day approach, hasn't he? In that,
Yeah.
super.
Yep.
Thank you so much, Eli. I know we're short on time, but you have absolutely given me lots of inspiration, and I hope so for the listeners too. Just to leave, I do have one other question, which is
Sure.
another
Yeah.
crazy question. I often ask my guests if I could give you any superpower to abolish something in the world of work for
Mm.
24 hours, because we don't want to abolish it forever, just in case it was the
Mhm.
wrong decision. So, is there something that's been niggling you about the world of work that you think we should definitely abolish?
Well, I don't know if this is exactly along the lines of what you're asking, but I do find it helpful to at least find one day a week to abolish meetings because they can often stand in the way of creative work. It's very hard if you're interrupted by a meeting, if you're sort of in a creative flow state to get back to it. So I think, and a lot of companies do this, but have a no meetings Wednesday or no meetings Friday. That can be an effective way to set aside time for creativity. So banish meetings for a day in your work week.
Fantastic. I've actually had Professor David Pereira on, did the world's biggest study on no meeting days.
How'd it turn out?
Oh, amazing. And we explored so many different aspects. And he said the sweet spot's around 2 days a week. If you have no meetings for 2 days a week, then that's usually where we're at optimal in terms of productivity, the other good things around well-being. So yeah, that's a fascinating episode as well. And I learned a lot. So I agree with you. I think we definitely need some downtime from meetings.
Yes.
And once again, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been such a pleasure.
You're very welcome, Patty. Thanks for having me on. I enjoyed it, and hope you have a great rest of your evening.
It's the end of another episode. Thank you so much for listening. Please do connect with me via LinkedIn and drop me a message and let me know your favourite takeaways from the episode. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the Superpower School newsletter so that you can be notified of all future episodes. Simply visit the website www.superpowers.school. Thank you once again.